And may the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you, as it is certainly not with this world. We're in the 15th book of Israel, chapter 14. And this is Barack Obama talks of crusades. The House of Yahweh shows when they will stop. Number 2. That is, Barack Obama talks of crusades. The House of Yahweh shows when they will stop. Now, you heard this word being played out this week with all the different things that are taking place. They're actually, again, calling for these crusades. They just refuse to learn from their mistakes, I guess. But I'm going to start here in verse 2. He says, I've got to make an announcement about the peaceful scene. Pastor really gets into this in this sermon, and he paints such a great picture for us that, it gives us something that we can look forward to. The life that we live right now is often high stress, little reward, day in, day out, work, and nothing really to enjoy, outside of the scriptures. And we have, great joy in the house of Yahweh, don't get me wrong with that. But the lifestyle that Pastor was talking about here, it's a very simple, peaceful, enjoyable lifestyle. And we have this peaceful scene down here to kind of paint this picture for us and to actually look at it and see what life was like then. And, he mentions this and says, I hope you don't miss it. I hope I didn't forget my notes. I don't know if you understand what this is about, but we're trying to put together down here. Now, come Tabernacles, you're going to see, Yahweh willing, you're going to see a self-supporting farm. And this is the way of life. This is the way of life that Yahweh ordained from the beginning. And that area down there, he said, hopefully you'll see corn being raised. he calls out one of our farmers here, ask. And he says, watermelons, pumpkins, pumpkins. That's this fall now. So get ready and to see a wonderful scene. And then in verse 3 he says, now, up until I was born, this was the way everyone lived. Yahweh said that you'll have your own vine and your own fig tree. And you will have a piece of land that you're going to grow food on. And that's what he's telling you here. That's a promise that Yahweh is telling us. And he gets actually into the size of the average farms here in Oklahoma. But he says, but anyway, the chickens, they're not just for show. If you remember that there was no refrigeration in my lifetime. That it was a while after where they came out with the gas refrigerator, the kerosene, and all those various things. But if you try to remember or try to imagine, living without refrigeration, air conditioning, a lot of the things that we take for granted. We could flick a light switch and lights come on. We don't have to keep kerosene and oil and oil lamps and things like that. It kind of removes a person from, any type of reality that this might, run out at some point in time. If you're using a kerosene lantern, you're going to be mindful of the usage of the kerosene, because you don't just have an endless supply of kerosene, With electricity, it's just like you don't know where it comes from. It comes from a pole. You flip the light, you pay your bill every now and again, and the lights come on. Well, if you had to raise a family and the nearest store was, a day's journey or whatever, you can imagine things would be done a little bit different. If you had to walk out to a well to go get water, you wouldn't leave water running. You would be very concerned about the water usage. If you had to dig a well, you would be very concerned about the pollution of that water. Because it would be quite a chore to dig another well. Well, these are all the things that mankind today is we don't think about. But Pastor wants us to think about it. He wants us to get in our minds this original way of life that, just look at what he said. He said that up until he was born, this is the way everybody lived. For the vast majority of mankind's existence, this is how people live. And then in verse 6 he says, but the chickens now, if you wanted a chicken, you didn't go to the freezer and you didn't get a chicken. You didn't have a refrigerator to keep it in either. You went to the chicken house and you got a fresh chicken. Fresh. You can't get any fresher than that. And if we had chicken and dumplings, that first thing, Mother would do in the morning, she would go out and she would get the chicken and dress it and then get the thing to cooking. With our family, it was more like just pure dumplings. You had a little bit of a taste of chicken, but, Dad said she could make more chicken and dumplings than any person he had ever saw with that one little chicken. Well, and again, that there's a certain level of conservation here. This is something that especially here in America, people are so far removed from that mindset. People get bored with, and Pastor mentions this in the next verse, in verse 7. He says, we'd have it for like 3 days in a row. Well, think about that. Think about how many times you go to eat and say, oh, that again? Had that yesterday. Had that last week. Oh, we had that last month, I'm looking for something new and exciting, we do this a lot, but, that we really ought not to. We ought to be thankful for what Yahweh puts in front of us, that it's clean, that it's healthy, and that we can, we can enjoy it. I know we all have, likes and dislikes with food, and working in the food business, I could probably tell the likes and dislikes of most everybody sitting here. But, that doesn't stop us from being thankful for, the food that we have. We should always remember that, because, this lifestyle, this is the original lifestyle that we're going to go back to. And that's what Pastor's saying. We're going back to this original lifestyle. Praise Yahweh. In verse 9 he says, but anyway, the chicken, you'd go to the pen and get a chicken, and that was your chicken dinner. That was your refrigerator, and you kept the chickens in it. And the goats not only gave milk, but they also gave meat. And then on certain occasions, when you couldn't butcher a cow or something like that with just one family of 9, and think of that, with no refrigeration, all the meat that is on a cow, what do you do with all that meat? Well, there's many ways to preserve it, but, what he's saying is that a lot of times that was saved for very special occasions. And you can read about that in the scriptures also, that when a special guest was to come over, they would say, well, go get a calf and slaughter it, go get it and prepare. So, he says, I think the way my family ate, they could have eaten a whole big cow in one meal. But we were eaters because we were hungry people. When dinner was served, there was never a gripe about dinner. This is in verse 9. There was never a gripe about dinner. Not that I know of. I can never remember anybody griping about the food. The kid goats, you could pick up the goat, and it was just the right size, and would last 2 or 3 days. So you and your goats running around on foot, you didn't have them in a refrigerator or a freezer. The cows were the same. They gave milk like the goats, and they gave more milk and butter and cheese and cottage cheese and clabber milk, and we have all of that now. He says clabber milk and whey. And if we have the best cheese, we do have the best cheese. He says, I think in the world right now, I would say yes, for certain we have the best cheese in the world right now here at the House of Yahweh. I know it's one of the things that I live on. But, in verse 11 he says, what you're seeing here is much like what you see in the scriptures. In fact, it's all the scriptures there that you're seeing, and it makes you think of Eliah and Elisha. Now, these were the two main characters in that college. And of course, Pastor's talking about a school, a college, not like what we've seen in the world. I remember searching for such a college. It seemed like where I grew up, everybody was interested in things that I wasn't interested in. I wanted to find out the truth, and I was so excited to get out of high school, because in high school everybody was telling me, you got to go to college. Your questions are too big for high school, but in college they can answer your questions. So I went to college, and man, did I ever feel robbed, I think it was one semester that I lasted there, but I wanted to take all these classes. I had all these questions that I wanted to answer, and I think I took philosophy. I dropped out of that, I think, on the second class. In the middle of the second class, I got up and walked away. I said, no, these people, they're arguing over about nothing, Is the world flat? Is the world round, Are you underwater? Are you really wet? I mean, these were the types of deep thought that people would go to really, sink their mind into, and that wasn't the type of answers that I was looking for, But here, this college, this was actually to teach a way of life, not to teach to get a degree, to educate in the ways of the world. This was to teach a way of life. That you could raise your own garden, that you could raise your own cattle, that you could, have all of those things yourself, and know how the proper way that Yahweh requires us to deal with those things. Because everything that Yahweh teaches about it is to teach how to be fruitful and multiply and all those. Yahweh's laws protect us from sickness, hunger, all the things that we see in the world. Yahweh's laws would protect us of it, and that was the type of thing that was taught here at the great House of Yahweh. Now, they raised their own food. They didn't go to Walmart every day. In fact, he said, my mother, as best as I can remember it, she would go into town maybe twice a year, at spring and at fall, and she would get her supplies. Her supplies being mostly like beans, sugar, salt, things like that, pepper. So there were things that she went into town to get, but for the most part, everything was grown right there in the yard. Go turn to page 156, and in verse 13 he says, but in the peaceful solution seen here, you have a school of the prophets going on. It's like you had in Eliah's day, and if you remember, they used oxen for plowing at that time. Now, an ox is very strong, either a cow or a bull, a castrated bull. And they can pull a plow by themselves. They can pull a heavy plow. They're like this horse that we have down there. And I'm sure all of you have seen that. If you haven't, that's a big horse. And when you get up close, it gets bigger. And you could feel, when it goes and walks around, you could feel the ground kind of shaking. And Pastor's showing here, the work that can be done with such an animal. He says, we have a breaking plow, and I've noticed one of the field trips where the boys were going to school, they had this breaking plow out there, and all the boys got a hold of it, and there were about 20 or 30 boys that got a hold of that plow and couldn't move it. Well, that horse now, that shows how strong that horse is. They hooked it to that horse, and that same day that horse wanted to run with it. So that's the amount of strength that's in these animals that Yahweh had put there in order for mankind to be able to work the ground. And so there was nothing. It was nothing for that horse to pull. In verse 15, well, that's the way an ox is. An ox is very, very strong, as the scriptures show, and you can hook plows behind an ox. This is one of the characteristics that you read about in the scriptures, and then you should know that when you're reading and you see that being brought up about the ox, that Yahweh is describing a certain characteristic there. They didn't work as well as horses. They weren't that trainable, but they would work if you led them. Now, they are still used in places like China and other places in the world today. Now, in verse 16... well, the same thing now was going on with Eliah and Elisha. with that school of the prophets, as it's known in the Holy Scriptures. And when Yahweh sent them out, which He had to send them out to gossip or preach or whatever you want to call it, but they took the message out. And this is what we are doing today here in the great school of the prophets, the great House of Yahweh. We're taking this message out to all the world. And the two main characters were Elion and Elisha, but there were a lot of other characters in that group. And he says, in fact, it was a large group that probably about the same size as this group here today. Well, in verse 17, and they had a bit of land. I thought about it on the stage today. I should have looked to see what size the average farm was in Oklahoma. But when I was a child, it was, I would say, about 40 acres. Was a big farm, and that 40 acres, you would have enough pasture land to pasture a cow and a calf, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4. But you would also have a garden spot, and think about that. We have a perfect picture of that right here on this 44 acres. And look around, not just at the peaceful scene, but where the sanctuary sits, and then the north side, and the east and the west, and think about all that land and what you could raise on a plot of land that big. It would be enough to take care of a family, and then also to provide an income, because there were certain crops that people would raise for trading. Whatever, you could make use of that land as an income, as well as a way to support your family with healthy, clean, fresh food. But you could take a small garden, and anyone who knows anything about canning or conservation, you could take a small garden and you can put back a lot of food. Well, I don't know how many have tried, gardening. I haven't really put too much effort into it, but I did have a tomato plant, and I was real surprised about that tomato plant, how many tomatoes the thing would put forth, and it was neat because it wouldn't just put them all out at once. Like throughout the year, you can go through it and pick tomatoes. It's like it would continuously throughout, spring and summer, it would bring forth tomatoes. And I thought that was neat the way Yahweh made this, so that it would be continuously feeding us, But all kinds of things like that. Pastor talks about poke salad here. I don't know however many of you have tried that. It grows all over the place around here. Now, he does warn that you don't eat it raw. You have to cook it. But that is one of the greens here that grow that can be very delicious when they're cooked and prepared correctly. Well, in verse 22, but the horses, they were used every day. I can't remember a day when they weren't, except for the 7th day of the week. And when we would stop and let the horses rest and feed them, we'd take care of the cows, the chickens, and things like that. He said, visit the chicken pen and see. We've got a small brood of chickens down there, and we've got a couple of goats, and we've got a horse. We should have had a milk cow, but didn't get to it. But he said, now we've got a donkey too, and that donkey loves children, and children can actually do a lot of work with a donkey. And again, look at the character that is in this animal, because this is the character that Yahweh describes us as. He says, if you get a donkey trained, that donkey loves you, and he'll do anything for you. And he says, now if he hates you, he'll balk at you, and you'll get him. You won't be able to get him to do anything. They get very, very stubborn. Now we don't hate anybody here in the house of Yahweh, but when the world tries to get us to do their evil ways, we get very stubborn, and we get to where we just say, nope, I'm not going to do it. But when we know the voice of our teacher, and Yisrayl Hawkins gives us any kind of instruction, we're real quick to do it. That's the very character that Yahweh points out here that's in this animal, the donkey. He said, well, that peaceful scene now is going to be open, and he gives the hours. And in verse 24, he says, and you will see from that, if you'll just imagine the farm that I was raised on and the brush arbor meetings. This was another thing, that was prevalent at that time period that is more or less gone. It is gone today outside of the House of Yahweh, people would talk about the Scriptures. Even I remember that kind of growing up, that the Scriptures were something that was talked about. It wasn't until, very recently that the Scriptures became something very evil spoken of. And of course this was because all the gutless preachers in the world, that they would cave when the television came out. They were losing their popularity, and there was some that stood against it at first, but eventually they all started, when they would lose part of their congregation, they would quit and they would come up with a new message, something a little bit watered down until now you have people like the Pope who I don't think there was a single scripture that the Pope of Rome stands for outside of the ones there in Revelation 18. But he says, and you will see from that, you'll just imagine the farm that I was raised on and the brush arbor meetings. And now the brush arbor meetings were quite away from my house. Dad wouldn't let them put them too close to my house for privacy's sake. But he would allow them to put them on his land. And Dad would help build it. And they'd have a couple of neighbors. But that was actually where we got quite a bit of education from those brush arbor meetings. And quite a bit of it, as Pat Robertson said, he said, I don't want to repeat his words, but he got pretty nasty about what the Pope brings out and what Christianity brings out about Christmas and so forth. And this has always been a personal, a topic that I feel very related to, because it was my hatred for Christmas that actually brought me to the House of Yahweh, as far as I could tell. Growing up, I always hated Christmas, and the only, when I got that Christmas booklet, I read it, and I was ready to go right then and there. I was like, all right, I'm going to this place. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I'm going to go to this place. So, I didn't even read or understand much about the address or anything. But I was in Michigan at the time, and I was asking people about the House of Yahweh. Have you ever heard of the House of Yahweh? And one of the guys that I worked with, he was from the East Coast, and he said, Yahweh ben Yahweh? And I said, maybe, I don't know. I'm looking for the House of Yahweh. And he's like, I told him I was getting ready to move to Virginia. And I said, do you think I could find the House of Yahweh in Virginia? And he said, yeah, you can find anything in Virginia. So I did. I went to Virginia, and, true story, within a month, not quite a month and a half, I met up with somebody from the House of Yahweh. And I was so excited, because somebody that I knew kind of introduced us, and I'd asked him, he said he was getting ready to go to Texas. And I was like, oh, no, Texas. What do you want to go to Texas for? And he said, well, I'm going to Abelin. And I remember that word, and I'm like, Abelin. I said, what are you going to Abelin for? And he said, the Feast of Passover. And automatically, I'm like, you know about the House of Yahweh. And that shocked him quite a bit. But, that was, with all these means of technology, you can actually count. I went back recently and looked at the day, but that was 7,196 days ago that I attended my first Sabbath. It was with a group of the House of Yahweh out of town. And, shortly after I came here to Yahweh's house and have never left. But he said, if you notice, these preachers, the reason they're doing this is because we're forcing them to. We're putting the truth out there. We're putting the truth out there, and people are asking them questions. And if you know, and if they know and they tell a lie about it, the people are going to know that they're lying. The people usually present themselves with they usually present them with some truth or some proof and say, is this truth or not? Well, they can't say it's not. It's the truth. It's history. It's black and white. Well, and that's what the House of Yahweh does. It brings forth facts that are absolutely undeniable. And that's why, we've always tried to tell people, if you get into a conversation with somebody about the Scriptures and you bring forth the name and the Sabbath, if they're not willing to accept those things, they're not going to accept anything else. There's no, all the proof in the world shows that the name of the Creator is Yahweh and that the seventh day of the week is not Sunday. Okay, so if you can't prove those 2 points to somebody, that you're not likely going to prove the clean and unclean laws to them, or some of the deeper things that we're taught here. But so keep that in mind. The House of Yahweh brings forth this truth, and it does so by bringing forth the facts. And we see this being broadcast from the House of Yahweh with prophetic words and newsletters and through the press releases. But in verse 26 he says, you can't deny that Christmas is a pagan holiday. It was celebrated in Egypt. Their own preachers, unless they're just totally dumb, they even recognize this, and they say, well, it was Christianized. We Christianized it, and that's why we celebrate it. Well, Yahweh tells us not to do those things. And if a person is obedient to the things that Yahweh tells us in His Holy Scriptures, then you're going to know better. And this is what the House of Yahweh does: is it brings people back and says, look at these Scriptures. Measure up your belief against this, because this is the very word of Yahweh. He says there was money in it, and they didn't want to give up the money. The Easter, Christmas, Halloween, all those things. They were in Egypt, and they brought them out. So keep that in mind. This is a very special Sabbath. It is really great to see so many people here tonight, and I very much look forward to this. But at this time, if you all please stand, I will have the great privilege to introduce a great priest in the House of Yahweh, the great Kohen David Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. It's an honor and a privilege for me to address the called out ones of the House of Yahweh this evening. I'd like to continue where great Kohen Kifa Hawkins just left off. We're studying Pastor's sermon that's listed. That's chapter 14 in the 15th book of Yisrayl, He Who Rules is Yahweh, and the title of this book is Righteousness Prevails. And the reason righteousness prevails is because Yahweh established His house in these last days by His two witnesses, and we're led at this time by Yahweh's last witness, the great Kohen Yisrael Abel Hawkins. And that's the reason that righteousness prevails here at the House of Yahweh, and it's spreading throughout the entire earth at this time through the message that's preached and published here at the great House of Yahweh. So continuing in chapter 14, it's titled Barack Obama Talks of Crusades. The House of Yahweh shows when they will stop. And this was from 5/24 of 2015. So we're going to continue on page 158. And I'm gonna go down to verse 31 here on page 158. Barack Obama has kind of opened a hornet's nest, Pastor says here, as you can see from his talk, and they're saying some nasty things about him because of what he said about the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were wars that the popes authorized in the so-called Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, the 10th century, 11th century, so 1100 years after Yeshua, A.Y. Okay, the Pope sent their armies to different parts of the world, the Middle East primarily, and they destroyed believers, and they took their lands, and so this was one of the armies these were armies that were authorized by the Vatican, and as the book of Daniel says in chapter 11, the army will stand on his part on the part of the Pope under his authority. And so continuing here in verse 31, and I'm so glad because this is opening the door to what we've been bringing for a few weeks now. I'm glad Barack Obama, is helping us along on these crusades, because the truth is that very few people know the cruelty of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, even though it's in their Bible. Even though, as it's shown in the Holy Scriptures, in Acts of the Apostles, they know nothing about this cruelty of the Catholic Church. But the Apostle Shaul, if you can remember, he said he drug out men, women, and children, and he got his orders from whom? Who did the Apostle Shaul get his orders to drag out these men, women, and children and to persecute them? He got it from the Roman general. Is that who he got it from? Remember, no, he got them from the high priest. So the Apostle Shaul was a Roman soldier, but he got his authority, as Pastor's pointing out here, from the high priest. If you were a Pharisee, Pastor says, you were a Roman citizen. Now that Roman state had to be invented long before that, and if you were a Pharisee in Jerusalem, never even been to Rome, you were a Roman citizen. And that's a pretty impressive fact. And there's a lot of rights conveyed to a person who was a Roman citizen. He had rights in the Roman courts. He was not a slave to the Roman system. He was a Roman citizen. He had the rights of Roman law. And the Apostle Shaul never had been in Rome, but he was a Roman citizen because, as Pastor is pointing out to us, he was a Pharisee. You were a Roman citizen, and that's all in Acts and the Acts of the Apostles. And Shaul was one whom Yahweh chose to show that. I'd like to just read from Acts chapter 22, and let's start at verse 3. And these are the words of the Apostle Shaul. He said, I am truly a Yadai, a man from Tarshish of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city, Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, who was a priest. He was a Pharisee, and was taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward Yahweh as you are this day. Notice in verse 4, and I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering both men and women into prison. Verse 5. So there you have it right there, his own testimony. This is what he did as a Roman soldier, operating under the authority of the Pharisees, the priests, who were in rulership at that time, and these were not priests of Yahweh who were in rulership. The high priest and the whole council of the elders can testify to this, and I also received letters from them. This was his authorization to do what he did, to drag men, women, and children back to be persecuted for what they believed, the laws of Yahweh. Where I also went to bring those who were there in chains to Jerusalem to be punished. And so this is one, Shaul, who Yahweh chose to call to do his work and to change his to teach him the right way rather than the way that caused them to persecute the called out ones of the house of Yahweh. So Pastor says here in verse 33, the great apostle Shaul, now, before he was converted, which, if you remember, Yeshua met him on the road, this was a great event because it showed that Yahweh and Yeshua could convert anyone. So sometimes, why did Yahweh call me? Why did Yahweh, you may ask that question. Why did Yahweh call me? Well, if you look at Shaul, the Roman soldier that Yahweh called, we could see that all things are possible. Yahweh called us, we were preordained to hear this message, to have an opportunity at this time in history to be part of Yahweh's last days work. That's a great honor for each and every one of us. And Yahweh said ahead of time, and the ones who He's called to His house, you are predestined, as the King James Version says, preordained. In other words, Yahweh planned this from the beginning. This shows you the type of control, the type of planning that Yahweh can do in establishing His house in these last days and calling us to be part of it. We were preordained, as the book of Yahweh says. You were preordained to become a son or daughter of Yahweh, and that's the reason you're here at His house, training, learning, training in the laws of Yahweh, learning the prophecies at the feet of Yahweh's last days witness, Yisrayl Hawkins, so that we can teach, do our part in bringing in this soon coming kingdom and being part of it and training and teaching the world and the universe. But the Apostle Shaul, he got his orders from the high priest, and then he would go out to different cities or just people hiding in the bush, in the woods, and find them. They had a congregation there and gathering that took place, and they wanted to keep the laws of Yahweh. And that was a no-no. Keeping the laws of Yahweh was a no-no at that time because of the fact that the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes didn't want to be any part of Yahweh anymore or His laws. They didn't want His name spoken, period. And we see that in the example of Pope Benedict, for example, in these last days. The last remnant of the name of Yahweh that appeared in some of the Catholic songbooks, he took it out. So up until that time, even the Catholics had an opportunity to be exposed to the name of Yahweh in their songs. But Pope Benedict put an end to that. And they threatened the prophets for prophesying in the name of Yahweh, and they changed the name even before Jeremiah's time, but Jeremiah spoke of it. He was prophesied to tell us about it, that they took the name out and caused the people to forget the name of Yahweh for what name? For the names of rabbis, for the names of lords, for the names of the gods. Skipping over to verse 36 here now. But if you remember now opposing Babylon, that's what the house of Yahweh was created to do in this time period, and to let people know all over the world. It says from the rising of the sun to the setting of the same, and that doesn't mean the sun goes up and down in the earth, or the earth turns around. The name pastor is described in Zechariah as the one who opposes Babylon. And Babylon is a strong worldly system at this time. It's a strong worldly system, but Yisrayl Hawkins is the one who Yahweh preordained to be one of the witnesses, and the one preordained to oppose Babylon and to bring forth Yahweh's system of government in these last days. And Babylon, as it says in Revelation, will fall. Babylon is falling. Yes, it is. And you can look around it now, and the world is at the brink of destruction. And it's not Yahweh that's bringing this destruction upon the world. It's the same type of destruction that we saw when the Assyrians and the other armies came up against Israel, the nation of Israel, and Yahweh answered the prayers of the Israelites, or the Hebrews, to save them from their enemies. And what occurred? Yahweh would cause confusion in the minds of their enemies, and they would destroy themselves. Well, this confusion that we see in the world today, it's among Babylon, out there in Babylon, that confusion, they're going to get caught up in their own confusion. And Pastor says it's going to get out of control, and they're going to totally destroy their own system. So, Yahweh is not he's not a vengeful Heavenly Father. He's a merciful Heavenly Father, and he's letting this plan go out to completion, while he's guarding and protecting us, the great house of Yahweh. This world is going to self-destruct. So when you see the setting of the sun, it doesn't make any difference how it got there, but you know it went behind the horizon when it set. Okay, so I'm going to go down to verse 38 here. Our job, as it says in Isaiah 45, Yahweh says, I called you, Yisrayl and Jacob, the names of the two witnesses, Yahweh's last days two witnesses, Yisrayl Hawkins and his brother Jacob Hawkins, so that they may know from the rising of the sun to the setting thereof all around the earth, that they will know all around the earth that I can foretell the future. I am the only power. Yahweh is in total control. The world worships the gods, and they have a little bit of false power that they can call upon, and the demons have certain authority that Yahweh allows them to have at this time. But the only source of power in the universe, the creator of all things, is our wonderful, awesome Heavenly Father Yahweh. I am the only source of power, he says. There is no gods beside me. I don't have anything to do with the gods. They're enemies of my work, and there won't be any gods when this is finished. No, Yahweh's system will completely take over the destroyed system of Babylon. Praise Yahweh. And going over to verse 40 here. Well, Yahweh foretells the future. That's something that no one can do except him. And he can inspire people to foretell the future, and they can't do it on their own. And then he talks a little bit about Gene Dixon, who made prophecies, but yes, 50% of them came true. The other 50% didn't. But Yahweh is right 100% of the time. Yahweh's plan is perfect. And when we understand every detail of Yahweh's plan, we're going to be in total amazement how Yahweh looked into the future and he planned out every little detail perfectly. Just absolutely perfectly. That is the type of control that Yahweh has in his planning. But Yahweh is 100% right all the time. He doesn't guess. He commands the host. Well, only you, the ones who we have told about, know about the host, which are the microorganisms. By the way, that was a wonderful lesson here today, Pastor says, on that very subject. But the host, the microorganisms, they control the whole universe because Yahweh commanded them to do so. And, mankind has a certain amount of control over the microorganisms. They use them for certain functions, in food production and things like that. But only Yahweh has the control of the total control of the microorganisms. They bring you rain. They bring you the proper amount of sunshine. They bring health to your bodies. There are many kingdoms working in your body right now, supplying every joint, every organ, with their needs. That's how your body is run. That's how Yahweh put you together, and he said, keep it this way now. Don't send things into your body that will destroy these microorganisms. And, he's talking about Yahweh's food laws for one thing. Eat the clean foods. Don't eat what his laws defined as unclean foods. Don't eat the blood. So Yahweh is telling us how to maintain our health here. He didn't put it in that manner, but he put it in the scriptures. Of course, it's hidden from the wise. It's hidden from the wise and the prudent, but it's revealed to the babes and the sucklings, and they understand it now. In verse 42 here, Yahweh can foretell the future. The gods can't. No, they can't. They cannot foretell the future. I think to some extent they understand that their own destruction is near. You see in the video productions they come up with these days, which are brilliant in deceiving mankind and implanting negative influences. So I think they understand their destruction is at hand, but only Yahweh can foretell and has foretold the future. The gods can't. No person can foretell the future. And now he says about Jacob and Yisrayl, I'm going to choose two people, and he names them, and from them all the world is going to know this thing. Yes, and that's in Isaiah 45. And Isaiah 44 gives you the names of the two brothers, and they are two brothers, Jacob and Yisrayl. In verse 44, well, Yahweh's prophets prophesied against those who spoke by the authority of the gods. You remember that Satan visited Eve and spoke to Eve? Well, actually, it wasn't Satan who spoke to Eve, but she inspired the priest, Satan's priest. Speaking of Cain here now, and those who followed Cain, who are called popes now, that's the one that the popes worship. They call her Mary now, but a rose by any other name, or a leopard by any other name, whatever, a bear by any other name is still a bear, and so is the Queen of Heaven, so is Mary, so is the adversary. Now these words, lords and gods, these were from the beginning, and there were two trees, and they weren't actually trees, were they? No, they were righteous. Abel, who had a congregation, and and then Cain, his brother, whose sacrifice, whose teachings were not acceptable to Yahweh, as he said. You know all of this, Scripture surely. No, there were two priesthoods, two different priesthoods, Christianity and the House of Yahweh. That's always been the choice, Christianity or other forms of it, and the House of Yahweh. The only two choices in the earth today. That's exactly what they were. The House of Yahweh taught Yahweh's perfection, his laws, his perfect laws, and said, be perfect as Yahweh is perfect. And that's what we're striving with all our hearts and minds to do, is to come into the image of Yahweh as we're commanded to do, exhorted to do, offered in Genesis 1 verse 26. The other tree brought forth evil along with this righteousness, and the other priesthood was bringing, and the evil grew, and people loved it. Then we're going over here to Jeremiah chapter 23, and we'll look at verse 1. Woe to the pastors, the shepherds who destroy and scatter my sheep. And this is Yahweh warning the pastors and the shepherds who don't teach the laws of Yahweh, those who follow the way of the gods, those who follow Cain's example and that he began. Well, this was the Roman Catholic Church under authority, under another name at that time. They were called priests of Israel. They were called priests of Israel, and this is and Gamaliel, Shaul's teacher, the apostle Shaul's teacher, was an example of this. They were called priests of Israel. Before that, they were called the elders of Israel, and these were the ones that Samuel contended with. And Yahweh said, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. They're rejecting the way of Yahweh. Before that, they were called Korites, who contended with Moshe, same group from the Levites. It started with the Levites and grew from there, and the temple was turned over to them so they could have their way. Yahweh did not hold them back. No, He's giving the adversary every opportunity to prove for all eternity that her way will not work, will not succeed. And it's only these last days when that final lesson can be learned, and that is this generation that's capable of bringing on a nuclear burning. Therefore, this is what Yahweh, the Father of Israel, says to the pastors. And Yisrayl Hawkins here, pastor, says, pastors, so they had pastors and priests and preachers and so forth in the land of Israel. And the scripture continues, who feed my people, you have scattered my flock. And this is what Shaul was doing. He was scattering the flock of Yahweh. He said, and driven them away from my house. Well, those were the ones that the apostle Shaul went out hunting. And when he found them, he would drag them back in chains, men, women, and children. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a group of people dragged back in chains behind some Roman soldiers on horseback, dragged back to Jerusalem? What a distressing situation. Not any more distressing than what we see in the world today or what the popes did when they sent their armies out in the Crusades. And as Barack Obama said, much like today were the Crusades at that time. Barack Obama didn't know or hasn't put it together yet, but he will now, that this was actually started way back in Jeremiah. Which of the prophets have your fathers not persecuted? Yes, the fathers of this priesthood, they persecuted Yahweh's prophets. They killed Yahweh's prophets. Well, he's speaking of the Pharisees. He's speaking of the Sadducees. He's speaking of the Essenes and the Herodians, the lawyers. Verse 49, they had lawyers. They call them masons. They call them masons now, but they call them lawyers or priests of the law, who would strive to find someone that they could file charges on, like Yeshua or Yochanan. And we know what occurred to both Yeshua and Yochanan. They took their lives. They would say, they're breaking this law. See? And then they'd file charges on them and arrest them. And if you read about the Crusades, the person could not say anything for themselves. They weren't allowed to know who the one who accused them were. And that's one of the things the forefathers of the United States, the government that we live under now, and the chief of the nations, they addressed this particular complaint when they wrote the Constitution. So that in itself is a form of protection for Yahweh's house in these last days, that some of these things were corrected to the point where we can benefit from them. They could present in the court certain people saying that they were their enemies and made them out like that would sway the jury, because if you named someone that had turned in information on him and the accused person tried to say, that accuser is my enemy, he was just guessing as to who it was because he didn't even know who accused him. And this, like I said, this was one thing that the founders of this country, who were probably Masons, but nevertheless, Yahweh, Yahweh puts things in place that His house would be protected in these last days. He might have. It might have been a cruel police officer or a cruel person with a sword who was the one who accused him because they got his property and the property influenced them. They got their wealth, so they were being paid to find people with wealth and that they could accuse of being heretics, as they call them, a heretic. A heretic is one who didn't believe in the Catholic Church, what the Catholic Church was putting out. So that was pretty easy to assassinate someone's character by calling them a heretic, or calling them a cult member, or calling them whatever, saying they're dirty, nasty people and they don't belong in our town, or whatever they were accusing them of. And that's what they did. They assassinated their character. They turned people against the called out ones, and so it was easier to justify getting rid of those people. Now, that's in the days of what they call the Crusades. And they're blind right now because the Crusades are still going on. Yes, they are, but a little more high tech, a little more high tech than running a person through with a sword. There are other ways to destroy people, and that's what's continuing in this Babylonian system against the plan of Yahweh. And that's what Barack Obama was saying, that the Crusades are still going on. They're just like the ones the Christians were doing. Well, the Christians, they still have crusades going on. They killed some Yahweh people up north, and there he's referring to the situation in Ruby Ridge, I believe, Idaho. That's what Pastor's referring to here. And they burned some to death, some Yahweh people to death down in Waco. And there he's referring to the David Koresh and the Branch Davidian situation, where they burned about 70 people in the end, and plus the half a dozen that were killed on both sides when the initial raid was. And they didn't have to go in there and with guns blazing at Waco. They could have arrested David Koresh when he went into town for shopping. So, but no, they chose to make a point of it, and it didn't quite work out the way they planned. And in the end, it was they turned one of the things that worked against the government in the Waco situation, the Branch Davidian situation, was it turned the people against the government, doing this to other people, like the House of Yahweh. They got a black eye. The federal government got a black eye because they went in and killed these people, but yet they said they went in to save the children because the children were being abused. No, in the end, they killed the children and the adults. So that's one of the ways that Yahweh turned popular opinion in this country against the federal government, doing the same thing here at the House of Yahweh, because the neighbors of Yahweh in this area, they wanted action. They wanted action against the House of Yahweh. What kind of action? They didn't say, but Waco had occurred two years before this article came out, where the neighbors of Yahweh said, we want action. So, just finishing up here, in verse 52, but Yahweh says, in verse 3, but I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries. And that's who we are. We're the remnant gathered from all countries. The members of the house of Yahweh have come from all countries of the earth to be here at the great house of Yahweh. And what an honor and a privilege it is to be part of Yahweh's last day's work. Well, that's what he's done. And believe it or not, your parents all came from those countries. These were the ones who were being persecuted. So here we see, brothers and sisters, we see brothers, the plan of Yahweh, and we can read from the great book of Yahweh how Shaul persecuted the called out ones, and yet Yahweh called him out, turned his thinking around, taught him the truth, taught him Yahweh's plan, and he became a great servant of Yahweh, just as each and every one of us have an opportunity to be a great servant of Yahweh. May Yahweh bless your understanding on this wonderful Sabbath day and forever.